Hey, this is Anand. Welcome to another edition of the 1500 plus SAT Masterclass. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about using commas to separate introductory elements from the main clause in a sentence. Okay, so this is a pattern that is part of the grammar section of the SAT, specifically under the boundaries and transitions domain. Okay, and typically you can expect one or two questions from this pattern on the SAT, and if you know how to answer them, this is really easy points. Okay, and there is really just one rule to follow, and I'm going to teach you that. And after that, I'm going to follow it up with a number of questions that are representative of the different ways in which the SAT would like to test your understanding of this concept. All right. And this video is part of a series of videos on SAT grammar, and I've provided a link to the playlist in the description. Okay. And practice, that is what is going to make things perfect. And for practice, just go to justloggedin.com where you can practice this pattern and pretty much every other pattern on the SAT. And I provided a link to that in the description as well. All right, so let's get started. So let's look at what an introductory element is, right? So if you watched our previous video on connecting independent clauses, then you already know what an independent clause is, and you know how we use certain rules to connect the independent clauses, right? So here, introductory element, when you're dealing with this, the pattern is very similar, except that you're going to have an independent clause, and then the first clause, or I would say a group of words. It could be a clause, it could also be a phrase, or it could even be a single word that would actually qualify or set a context for the second part of the sentence. Okay, so that is what is an introductory element, and we'll see how to identify that, and how to answer questions in this pattern. All right, so let's look at what we have here, right? So look at these examples. We have suddenly the lights went out. Okay, so the lights went out is a valid sentence. Okay, so this is an independent clause. All right, so an independent clause is one which can stand alone as a sentence, right? I mean, it has a subject, it has a verb, and it expresses a complete thought, right? Then it is an independent clause. So the lights went out is an independent clause here. So similarly, the streets were quiet is an independent clause. Okay, it stands alone as a sentence, and that is the main part of this whole sentence. And similarly, the bus was rerouted is an independent clause. They can stand alone as a sentence, and that expresses the main idea in all of these sentences. Now, this word here, suddenly the lights went out. All right, so this is a this is the introductory element. Okay, so this qualifies or adds something to this particular sentence, okay, or it sets the context for the action that happens in this sentence, right? So similarly here, after the storm, and over here it says, because the road was flooded. This is a dependent clause, right? So because the road was flooded, the bus was rerouted. So the bus was rerouted is the main message. That is the main statement. This is the qualifier which sets the context, and it says, hey, the bus was rerouted. Why was it rerouted? Because the road was flooded. Okay, and the rule here for introductory element is very, very simple. I didn't use a plural, I used a singular, right? There is just one rule, and that is after an introductory element, you always put a comma. Okay, there's nothing else. There is no semicolon, no colon, no dash, nothing. It is just a comma after an introductory element. All right, so we're going to see examples of how you add introductory elements, and you'll also see why comma is the only punctuation you would use here. All right, so here let's take an example. All right, the concert began. All right, so this is a statement. If we remove the full stop, it's an independent clause. Okay, there is a subject, there is a verb, it expresses a complete idea, and this is an independent clause, and then a complete sentence. Now I can add a qualifier at the beginning. I can say, finally, the concert began. All right. So this is an introductory element, and it's just a word. And after the word, I have a comma. All right. So finally, the concert began. Or we could say, after a brief delay, the concert began. All right. So this is also an introductory element, and we use a comma. After a brief delay, the concert began. So if you look at this, if we just forget this comma for a moment, and if you just look at after a brief delay, it is not an independent clause. It cannot stand alone as a sentence. Similarly, finally cannot stand alone as a sentence. It's just a single word. Okay? Because the storm had passed, the concert began. All right? So we are getting a little bit more complex. So it is a longer introductory element. Because the storm had passed, the concert began. Again, if you just pull this thing out, because the storm had passed, it is a dependent clause. It's not an independent clause. Okay, it cannot make a sentence on its own. It qualifies or it sets a context for what comes after the comma, or it sets a context for the main part of the sentence here, which is the concert began. All right. Now, this is a lot more complex. Finally, after a brief delay, the concert began. Okay. So we're here, finally, after a brief delay. Okay. So this is also an introductory element and then a comma before the introductory element. Now, the introductory element itself has a comma. That's fine. Okay. That's fine. That's legal, right? However, when the introductory element joins or when it meets the main clause in the passage, then there has to be a comma after it, okay? And that is the only allowed punctuation and nothing else. Now let's take another example. Okay, so this is an even longer introductory element. Because the storm had finally passed after several hours of rain, the concert began without further interruption. Okay? So this is the main clause. This concert began without further interruption. See, this is an independent clause. It can make a sentence on its own. Okay, and this one here before the comma, because the storm had finally passed after several hours of rain, this is the introductory element. And even though this is long, this is not an independent clause. It cannot stand on its own. All right. Why do I stress this whole concept of, or rather, the idea of the first one not being an independent clause? Because if it were, then we are trying to join two independent clauses, and therefore the rules for joining two independent clauses are different, and we have that covered in a separate video. Okay, so there's the spacey rule that we need to follow, all right, or the rule of the conjunctive adverb. So that's a completely different pattern. Okay, let's look at this question. By paving straight roads with layered stone and careful dash, created durable highways that endured for centuries. And if you look at these answer options, if you remove the punctuations here, you're just left with these two words, drainage and engineers. Okay, so let's just align here and then read this together. By paving straight roads with layered stone and careful drainage, engineers created durable highways that endured for centuries. So engineers created durable highways that endure for centuries. This forms a valid sentence. So therefore, this is an independent clause. However, by paving straight roads with layered stone and careful drainage, this is not an independent clause, right? This needs this clause to complete the sentence, right? So therefore, this is an introductory element. Okay, so this sets up the context, right? It front loads the sentence with some information, essentially saying, hey, how did the engineers create these durable highways? They did it this way. All right. So this is what we call a prepositional phrase, right? So therefore, this introductory element needs to be followed by a comma before the main sentence starts, and therefore, this is the correct answer. All right. Okay, let's look at the different kinds of introductory elements. Okay, so I put some names here: dependent clause, prepositional phrase, participial phrase, appositive phrase. Don't bother about all this. They said you couldn't care less whether you're able to name or figure out what type of a introductory element it is. Okay, so just this is just to give you a few examples. All right, so let's look at this one. Because the bridge had been closed for repairs, commuters found alternate routes across the river. So the commuters found alternate routes across the river. That's the independent clause because that can form a coherent sentence. All right. And this one sets the context. All right. Similarly, although the recipe called for fresh basil, so that sets the context, the chef substituted dried oregano without complaint. So similarly, astronomers captured images of a distant nebula. So that's the sentence, the independent clause. That's the main idea. When the telescope finally came online, that sets the context for this sentence, right? So this is a necessary context. Okay. Prepositional phrases. Okay. The cast stayed late to polish the choreography, and then we set the context saying during the week of final rehearsals, the cast stayed late to polish the choreography. Okay, so this is all, we use commas to separate the introductory element and the main clause. All right, so you could read the other two sentences as well, kind of similar. Participial phrase. So what is a participial phrase? Okay, so this starts with an ing or an ed verb form, like for example, racing, frustrated, built. Okay, so all of these participial phrases, they describe the noun that immediately follows the comma. Okay, so racing against the incoming tide, the researchers collected their last reef samples. Okay, frustrated by years of unreliable service, the neighborhood petitioned for a new bus line. Okay, built entirely from reclaimed timber, the pavilion drew praise from local architects. Okay, so for example, this one is in the passive voice. Let's say that if I change this to the local architects praised the pavilion, then the sentence won't make sense. Built entirely from reclaimed timber, the local architects praised the pavilion. That won't make sense because the architects were not built entirely from reclaimed timber, right? So when you use a participial phrase, then the noun that this thing describes has to immediately follow the comma. So the appositive phrase, right? So the appositive phrase is essentially, a descriptive phrase, okay, so that describes the noun directly after the comma, okay? So for example, here, a tireless advocate for clean water, Dr. Nadia did something, okay? So Dr. Nadia is a tireless advocate for clean water, okay? So you tell something about the subject before you present the subject itself or telling what the subject did or even naming the subject, okay? For example, the crumbling relic of the industrial age, the old mill. So this is talking about the old mill. So the old mill is the crumbling relic of the industrial age. So similarly here, an award-winning novelist and former physicist, so that is Marcus Lee Blentz. Okay, so you could say the founder of Amazon, Jeff Bezos did something. Okay, so you introduce the subject before you talk about them. All right, so these are some examples of introductory elements. So now let's go ahead and practice what we just learned. Okay, so practice, right? So that's the most important thing. If you you can watch these videos, you can watch me solve some of the problems or answer questions, but then you have to practice several questions yourselves, and that is how this concept is going to stick, and you will develop the pacing and the accuracy you need before you take the test. All right. So for practice, just go to justloggedin.com. Everything in justloggedin.com is organized according to the patterns that we are discussing here in these videos. In addition, you also have a number of tests that look exactly like the real ones. Okay. So go do that. So we'll go to Just Logged In, and what you do is once you go there, just go to Build Skills, go to Standard English Conventions Boundaries, and then you can either do question by question or you can take a timed practice test. So you can just have a practice test on just boundaries. All right. So if you do question by question, you can go choose the pattern. You can, so this is separating introductory element. So just click on that and you're going to get questions from this pattern. All right. And what you can also do is go here to reading and writing. And we go to standard English conventions, go to separating introductory element. So you're going to have the notes for everything that we discussed today. And then just go click on practice this pattern and you can go start practicing. It's the same thing that you got when you went via build skills. All right, so I'm going to go to bookmark questions. I chose a few questions here for us to answer. So let's go to boundaries. Okay, so you can bookmark questions too. So just go and hit the bookmark icon, whether you are taking a test, whether you are reviewing questions, or whether you are doing practice. All right, so you can always come back to it later, and it's all going to be nicely organized for you here. Okay, so let's go do this. So first question, with the lighting cues timed to the actor's breaths and a soundscape built from whispered dash turn silence into its most expensive instrument. So what you can do is let's just look at the answer choices, right? I mean, if we eliminated the punctuation here, they're all pretty much the same things here, right? So let's just write. So with lighting cues timed to the actor's breaths and a soundscape built from whispered consonants. Now this is not an independent clause, all right? So this cannot stand on its own. The production turns silence into its most expressive instrument. Yes, that is an independent clause that can become its own sentence. All right. So therefore, with lighting cues timed to actors' breaths and the soundscape built from whispered consonants, this actually sets the context for whatever follows. Okay. So therefore, this is an introductory element, and it has to be set off with a comma. So this is the correct answer. All right. So what we need to do here is that once we get a question, just look at the answer choices, eliminate all the punctuation, and just go write these words here, okay? And then divide them up logically, and then see what the first clause is and what the second clause is, and then see if they are independent clauses. If both of them are independent clauses, then you have to apply the connecting independent clauses rule. Okay, so go and watch that video for the rules. If they're not, if the second clause is an independent clause, then the first clause is usually an introductory element, and you set it off with a comma. All right. Next question. Seismologists monitor vibrations within Earth's crust. Although most earthquakes are too small, dash instruments detect them. Again, it's the same thing. If you ignored all the punctuations, then it's all the same. It's all the same words here, right? They differ only in their punctuation. So let's go and split it. Like we'll split it here. Okay. So seismologists monitor vibrations within Earth's crust. So that's a full sentence that sets a context, to leave it aside. So this is the sentence that we are most interested in. Although most earthquakes are too small to be felt, that is not a complete sentence. Okay. Sensitive instruments detect them. Yes, that is a complete sentence, and therefore it can be an independent. That is an independent clause. It can be a full sentence, right? Therefore, although most earthquakes are too small to be felt, it has to be set off with a comma, and then sensitive instruments detect them. So this is the correct answer, right? All right. So the next question. All right, let's look at this question. Researchers tested a wearable device that vibrates to alert drivers when they begin to drift from their lane. Okay, so this is just an introductory sentence. This is not very important. Let's just mark it. Designed to monitor subtle muscle activity in the forearm associated with steering corrections, the wristband can warn a driver before the car crosses a lane marker. Okay, so the thing is, the wristband can warn a driver before the car crosses a lane marker. This is an independent clause. Okay, and therefore, the one before the independent clause, that must be an introductory element, and because this is certainly not an independent clause, like designed to monitor subtle muscle activity in the forearm associated with steering corrections. That cannot be an independent clause because that cannot become a full sentence by itself, right? So therefore, it needs to be set off with a comma. Okay, so let's look at this one. This one has, these two don't have a comma, so I can strike this out directly. Now this one has a comma, and so does this one. Okay, but which is the right answer? All right, so let's look at this. Designed to monitor subtle muscle activity in the forearm associated with steering corrections, comma, the wristband can warn a driver. So this looks like it may be correct. So let's look at the other one. Designed to monitor subtle muscle activity, comma, in the forearm, comma, associated with steering corrections. This one is unnecessary, and this is not correct. Okay, so I would strike this out also. Okay, so this is the correct answer. This cannot be between commas because it doesn't make any grammatical sense. This answer, and we can move ahead to the next question. All right. While some robotics labs strive to design machines that mimic human others focus on robots built for repetitive precision tasks. These systems often operate. Okay, so this is all unnecessary. We don't focus on this. Let's just look at this one. So if you look at all the four choices, right? I mean, it's just movement, right? If you just eliminate the conjunction and the comma. So let's just substitute movement here and read it, okay? While some robotic labs strive to design machines that mimic human movement, and then the other ones, others focus on robots built for repetitive precision tasks. Others focus on robots. So this one is indeed an independent clause. Okay, so this can stand as a complete sentence. Whereas here, if you put movement here, while some robotic labs strive to design machines that mimic human movement, that is not an independent clause. It starts with a while. When you start with a while, then it is essentially a contrast structure, and therefore you need to finish it with, if not this, then what, right? So it's incomplete. Therefore, this is an introductory element. So typically, something starting with a while, they are introductory elements, and you just put a comma after the introductory element. So D would be the right answer. By the way, but is not the correct answer because with while you don't use a but. Okay, so you cannot say while some robotic labs do this, but others focus. No, so while already means contrast, so you don't use another contrast conjunction. Okay, so but is not correct. This is the right answer. All right. All right, let's look at this question. Documentary photographer Tessa Ko used lightweight rigs to capture motion without blur. Okay, that sets the context. The question is not here. While documenting the coastal festival, it starts with while, so we know it's an introductory clause. Okay, so let's look at this one. While documenting the coastal festival, the festival happened in 2012, so it is set off in brackets. So this is all there to kind of confuse you a bit, right? So we can actually, while documenting the Coastal Festival of 2012, okay, that's how you read it, co-mounted her camera on a gimbal and walked alongside. Do you say gimbal or gimbal? Okay, whatever. And walked alongside the parade to keep the horizon steady. Okay, so the co-mounted her camera on a gimbal and walked alongside the parade to keep the horizon steady. So that is an independent clause. It makes a complete, sensible sentence. All right. So while documenting the Coastal Festival, within bracket 2012, it has to be a comma. Co-mounted her camera on a gimbal. Okay. So this is the correct answer. You don't need an and here. It's always the introductory phrase is always followed by a comma. All right. So this is the correct answer. Okay. And let's move to the next one. Because superconductors, so we know that this is an introductory phrase when you see because. Okay. So let's look at this one. This is all the same word. Okay. Because superconductors display zero electrical resistance only below a critical temperature, researchers must keep samples chilled during tests. Researchers must keep samples chilled during tests. So that's the independent clause. That's the main idea of the sentence. So because whatever, this first phrase is an introductory element which has to be set off by a comma. Okay. So therefore, this is the correct answer. So below a critical temperature, comma, researchers must keep samples chilled during tests. So this is not correct because this is, you need a comma here after temperature, okay? Because it's an introductory element, and all of these are incorrect. Full stop is incorrect too because this is not a full sentence, okay? It's not an independent clause, so you can't add a comma, a full stop or a semicolon, which are reserved for independent clauses only. All right, let's go to the next one. Before the telegraph connected cities in the 1840s, messages sent over long distances might arrive days or weeks late. Okay, so this is a context. After a continuous wire was strung between Washington and Baltimore, operators could transmit coded signals in seconds. Operators could transmit coded signals in seconds is an independent clause. After a continuous wire was strung between Washington and Baltimore, that is the introductory phrase because it's not an independent clause and it has to be set up with a comma. All right. So Washington and Baltimore, operators could transmit coded signals in a second. It cannot be colon because this is not an independent clause. Okay, so colon is reserved for, in this context, it is reserved for connecting independent clauses. Similarly, semicolon for the same reason. The bracket doesn't make any sense because there is no closing bracket here, so the bracket doesn't make any sense. So therefore, this is the right answer. All right, so we are done. So these are all the different ways in which this particular concept will be tested. I think we covered pretty much all the patterns here. So it's a very simple pattern. You just need to figure out, just to summarize, just figure out whether the two parts of the sentence are independent clauses. If both are independent, you apply the connecting independent clauses rule. Otherwise, look at the first part. That is most likely an introductory element. So the only way to use an introductory element is set it off with a comma and then the second clause. Okay, so that's kind of the summary of this pattern, and we'll meet you in a different video.